Hey, good morning, UPPC. It's wonderful to be with you on the cusp of this holiday season, and I sure hope that you have a lot of things planned with family or friends, or just relaxation and rest. We need rest. We need the gift of our families, and so I pray that the next week is going to be a gift to you. Today we're gonna have a conversation about something that actually taps into our Revelation series, but is something we have to talk about now and then. Okay? And it starts with this question. What's your generosity story? What's your generosity story? You ever had that question posed to you? Not just in terms of giving generously and giving to those in your life that you care about, but when you received generosity, what's your story? Generosity, I will pose this morning, and you can agree or disagree, but generosity I am proposing this morning is perhaps one of the most powerful forces in our lives, and yet we don't talk about it very much. The first church that we read about in Revelation was the church of Ephesus, and the leader most associated with the church was Timothy. Open with me to 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17, and if you'll remember, when we started that series about Revelation, which we're going to continue and pick up later on this year, when we started that series, we talked about how Ephesus was a trade city that was very wealthy. But if you'll remember, the Christians there were experiencing some sort of persecution as it related to their own vocations. But Ephesus itself, it was a wealthy city. They prided themselves on their wealth. This is Paul's word to Timothy and to that church. Hear these words. He says, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Oh, there's some beautiful, beautiful expressions here. Remember, Ephesus, wealthy city. Paul is imploring them not to put their hope in the very thing that they prided themselves in. Because wealth, as Paul says earlier in chapter 6, can't replace the contentment that comes from life with God. And the result of contentment with God is a generous spirit. It's a desire to share with others. This is all so countercultural, but oh so powerful. We are shaped in our culture to be consumers or to be investors, not to be givers. There is so much language and messaging around those two dynamic forces, to be consumers and to be investors, but not to be generous. Think back to a time when you remember being generous, if you can. Think about that for a moment. Do you remember a time when you were generous with someone or somewhere? Maybe you bought someone coffee at the Wayside on a Sunday morning, which, by the way, that happens all the time. I love it. It's a wonderful hospitality, especially for guests. Maybe you bought coffee for someone at the Wayside. It just made you feel good. Maybe you brought a neighbor or a friend a meal after surgery or a loss. How did that make you feel? That feeling is imprinted in our minds and in our hearts, that feeling of giving. There is something powerful in that expression of generosity, isn't there? It's why we remember these moments. But then, how about a time where you were a recipient of someone being generous to you or to your family? I could list off a catalog of times when people were generous to my family or to my children, and I'll never forget it. I'll never forget the way it made me feel. You know, oftentimes these expressions are spontaneous or unexpected. And there was an experience I had in a Starbucks line several years ago that left an impression on me. Maybe you've experienced something like this. But I drove up in my Starbucks line, preoccupied with my day, probably on my phone, catching an email or texts or whatever. And I drove up to hand my phone over for the little digital scan of my Starbucks app. And the barista stops me and says, "No, your coffee is paid for. The person that was in front of you paid for your coffee." And I was shocked. Who would do this? Do I know them? Is it someone from the church? Is it a friend? I wish I'd ordered more. Right? She smiled and reassured me that no, the person in front of you just wanted to make your day. And I had the curiosity to say, "How many people have done this in a row?" And she said, "We're at 11. And so she asked me if I was interested in paying for the car behind me. I know. I said, no, no, I'm kidding. I said, of course. I looked over my shoulder to make sure it wasn't a 15-passenger van, but I said, yes, of course, I would love to pay for the person behind me. And you know what was so wonderful about that experience? It wasn't just experiencing the generosity of someone paying for my coffee in front of me, but then the way that it impacted the Starbucks staff as the barista, the employee at the window, turned and let them know, "We're at number 12. There's just something about the contagious nature of wanting to be givers. We all want that. We all want to be generous. And here's the thing I'm thinking. It's very difficult to become generous if you've never experienced generosity. Or it's very difficult to become generous if you don't remember the feeling that comes with generosity. I think that's what Paul's getting at here. We may give money or time because it's a tax break, or it makes you feel good, or because your spouse elbowed you in the ribs at the auction, right? But that's not quite what Paul's getting at when he speaks of generosity. That's not quite yet to the generosity that Paul is describing here. He's describing something that's deeper. Let me pause there, and I want to get back to it in just a moment. But there is a man named Martin Seligman who is recognized as one of the most influential American psychologists of our day. If you're familiar with him, he wrote a fascinating book that was on the New York Times bestseller list entitled Authentic Happiness. Authentic Happiness. And he has devoted his life and his research to the study of what makes people authentically joyful. What makes human beings joyful and experiencing a sense of wholeness in their lives, which results in happiness. Okay? He notes in his book that we all tend to think, and this is universal in our culture, we all tend to think that the secret to more happiness is just more. More money, more stuff, more success, more. But he says it turns out there's this gap between more and enough, that can never get bridged. It will never get bridged in your heart or in your mind or in your life, his research shows. More is never enough, is what he found. He calls it the myth of more. Of course, we buy into this myth that if we just accumulate more and more money, more stuff, then we would be happy. We, of course, are entering into a season where we are bombarded by messages of more, messages of discontentment. Your Christmas couldn't possibly be all that it should be unless you buy more, right? Unless you give the right gifts and you have the right decorations and all of the things that make Christmas more. But he argues, and he actually has found in his research, and this is kind of the point of his studies, is that if we accumulate more moments, especially around life-giving generosity, well, then we experience exponential happiness. So here's the question. What if our story of generosity was a catalog of experiences that made us happy? In our culture, there's an alternative. I don't mean to dog it because we're so blessed, but our culture's narrative is accumulation with no end. Accumulation with no end. It's the story that everyone is living. Make enough money so you can buy the stuff so that you can insure it, landscape it, have it taken care of, make sure you worry about it, inevitably so that you can sell it. And then when you sell it, you worry about who you're going to give it to, the money, proceeds, whatever it may be, in your will. Here's just maybe if you could part the veil just for a moment, and I struggle with this just as much as anybody. What a boring story. Who sits down at the end of their life and says, I want to work to gather and accumulate possessions and things so that they burden and weigh me down, give me anxiety, and I have to worry about their protection in order to someday sell them so I can inevitably give a third of it or half of it to the government. And maybe a little bit from my kids. But that's the story that everyone is trying to live, the same narrative of greater accumulation. It's captured the imagination of our hearts, of our culture. At this point in time, you and I live in the most affluent and wealthy society that has ever existed in all of human history. We put Ephesus to shame. You go anywhere around the world and you talk with people and they're just curious about the American experience because they know that we live in unprecedented wealth. Even the poorest among us in this church would be considered wealthy by most of the world's standards. We are the wealthiest populace that has ever existed in human history. And we're about to be thrust into the next 5 weeks the largest expense and contribution towards that capitalist vision in all of human history. It is always going up in the American experience. Isn't that fascinating? Can I just ask you a question? With all of that vision being realized, the accumulation of wealth, the ability to buy whatever we want for this next consumerist season that is so huge in the next 5 weeks, let me just ask you, are we happier? Do you notice or do you feel like, and generally when we're walking through the grocery store or with friends or around, is everyone just so happy right now as a result? Are we just skipping down the grocery aisle? I've hit the lottery. I'm an American. I'm part of the wealthiest group of individuals that have ever lived in human history. Are we more happier? No. Because the pursuit of happiness doesn't actually start there. It doesn't find its home there. In the midst of incredible affluence, and even with the awareness of the needs around us in our world, often, if we're just honest, is our imaginations have been captured by a story of more wealth as opposed to a story of more generosity. What is your generosity story? Put another way, what's your happiness story? Generosity and happiness go hand in hand. This is why Paul's wisdom comes to us in such a time that is so beautiful. He says these words, lay up treasures in heaven so that, did you catch it? That they may take hold of life that is truly life. Life that is truly life. I love that. Wouldn't it be something if our identities and what we're most proud of or known for were exchanged or dovetailed into being known and being proud for how generous you were. I'll tell you, I stand here in this place leading so many people's memorial services. Some of you in this room, I'll be standing here, or a pastor of our staff will be standing here talking about your life. And when it all comes down to the end, they won't be talking about your stuff. I won't be talking about your stuff. I won't be talking about your salary or your investments or your 401k. We won't be talking about your cars or your vacations. We'll be talking about your legacy of giving and your character and what you offered generously to the world. That's what we'll be talking about. How do you exchange one identity for another? An identity of seeking more for an identity of generosity. Perhaps one of the most memorable stories about generosity came from an author named Stu Weber, and he tells a story about his son. I just love this story. Perhaps you've heard it before, but he had 3 boys, and the third of his 3 boys was named Ryan. Now, Ryan was the sensitive kid. He was the typical third child, and he was shy, and he really couldn't compete well with his older brothers. One brother was an all-league football player and an amazing all-star athlete. His second older brother then was an incredible student, was known for how successful he was in his education. And here is Ryan, just in middle school, who was shy and didn't show the same kind of gregarious, success as a student. Well, as a family, they spent a lot of time outdoors, and it turned out that Ryan had an amazing pocket knife. That was the best pocket knife the family had. And of course, if you've been outdoors, you know that the man with the blade gets the job done. And the pocket knife became Ryan's identity. In the family, he was the man with the blade. Hey, Ryan, can I use your knife? Hey, Ryan, can I borrow your knife for a minute? His older brothers always had to ask him if they could use his knife to set up camp. That became his status in the family because he was the man with the blade. Stu writes that his birthday came around and his family was busily planning the party for him, and they wanted to celebrate Dad. Early in the afternoon, Ryan, his youngest, walks into his office at home where he was studying. And at first he couldn't hear him. He just felt his presence, and then he turned around. And his son, Ryan, had chosen that moment because he wanted to give his dad a birthday present, but not at the birthday party. He handed him a present, and Stu unwrapped this present to discover that it was Ryan's knife. He tells of how he broke down because his son would delight in him so much that tears just flooded his eyes, that he would give the one thing that was part of his identity that he was most proud of. He gave him his knife. What would people say your identity revolves around? What's your pocket knife? And how could you use that to create a better story of generosity? You see, if Ryan had just kept his knife in his pocket, he would have every right to do so. In fact, no one would even question it. But his generosity story, and this will now be known throughout time, as Stu Weber in his authorship and speaking has shared this story countless times. He is known now for the generosity story where he delighted more in his father than in his identity as the holder of the pocket knife. This is the heart of generosity that changes the world. What would you like your generosity story to look like? What kind of pocket knife story would you want to have that your children would tell? That those in your community and friendship circle would speak at your memorial. But here's the thing. It has to be your story of generosity because no one else can tell that story. Years ago, my daughter was 5 years old. She was a kindergartner, and she was having her first week at school with Mrs. Hunter. Now, Mrs. Hunter was a member of our church for many, many years before they moved, and we just loved her. But she'd always fill us in on the funny things that kindergartners do, little kids do, right? And she shared us this one story, is that week they have to do assessment, find out, okay, if it's a kindergartner, do they know their letters? Do they know their numbers? And so she asked Natalie, do you know your letters? Can you tell me the alphabet? And she proudly said, I don't know my letters, but my brother Peter does, and he's just down the hall. He can tell you. And she was convinced that you don't need to know your letters. You don't need to, express that because someone else can do it, right? It was so cute. Oh, she was just so adorable. And she had no idea that the goal, of course, was for her to know her letters, her story of learning, right? Perhaps we fall into the same trap, thinking, well, someone just down the road, or let's just put it in this room, someone just down the pew, they'll give. I don't have to give. Or in some cases, I think sometimes we'll talk ourselves out of things because we say, well, other people have affluence and I don't. Other people have the ability to give or express generosity. I don't. But the generosity story is yours and yours alone to cultivate, right? The path to a better story starts with your part, not delegating it to someone down the hall or down the pew or down the block. Otherwise, we lose our own part in the story of learning and generosity. The path to a better story starts with your part. What you have been given and your calling to be rich in good deeds, as Paul says, to be rich in good deeds and be generous and willing to share. Okay. I want to stop there and just attend to something, because this is something we have to talk about at UPBC on occasion. But I also want to just speak to something that is real. I know this is real for our staff here at UPBC. I've had conversations with staff members, and I'm concerned about how the economic times we're in right now are impacting them. But I want you to consider these next questions or promptings without any sort of guilt or pressure. Okay, that's not my heart. It's not the heart of this church. But these economic times are difficult. And maybe you're one of the few that you go to the grocery store and you don't even think twice about how much groceries have increased. But I was talking with someone earlier this week that did some research on inflation. And over the last 10 years, inflation has risen 32%. And yet, for most people, salaries and growth in their income has not increased to that degree. And so this is a difficult time. It's difficult to be generous when you feel constraints in other areas. And so I wanted to share a couple of thoughts here about that. First is I want to invite you as a member of UPBC and as a follower of Jesus Christ to seek to discipline your heart, mind, and words to add a sense of thanks to the pressures you face. To add a sense of thanks to the pressures you face. To recognize what you do have, even as you're feeling anxiety and are overwhelmed. For those who are renting these days, I know the pressure is just crushing. Rental costs have almost doubled for some families. I know I've talked to several that's occurred. If you don't have those sorts of struggles or anxieties or being overwhelmed, then count yourself blessed and give thanks. But what is a way that in your heart and in your mind you could be giving thanks to God and in your life? Discipline yourself. The cultural messaging is always teaching you a different narrative, which is discontent. Discontent. It's not enough. Or what if scenarios, as if God isn't going to take care of you. Okay? Discipline your heart. Second is there's a lot we know that causes stress and discouragement in our day, but in tough times, it can take us back to remember God's promise of relationship with us and his care for you. You will never be forsaken. you will never not be taken care of because of God's protective hand in your life. Trust that. Jesus himself did that by never owning a home or a possession aside from his clothing. He trusted the provision of God. We can too. And then lastly, my heart for you is to experience the joy of giving and the thrill of practicing generosity. It is such a wonderful feeling. And my experience has been that the will-do attitude towards generosity always follows the want to. It's one thing to want it, it's another thing to just say, I'm going to will it. I will do that. I will experience the joy of generosity in some way over the coming weeks and months. Looking ahead to this season at UPBC, I have a second question, and it's more specific than the first. What would you like your generosity story to look like? What, looking forward, would you like your generosity story to look like? That's my challenge and my take-home question for you. Do you want to become a generous person? Look ahead. Don't beat yourself up for what could have or should have happened or what you think you could have done better. I have a friend who just feels so racked with guilt about the fact that he's neglected some of his tithing in the past. I said, brother, you can't change that. You don't owe God. You're not in deficit. But change the perspective towards what's ahead. What can you do moving forward if you want your generosity story to look different? Okay? That's my prompting for you. This is what Jesus' people can be encouraged by when we think about Paul's words to Ephesus and the church that Timothy was leading. Paul's words are to a church that's going to thrive and experience the happiness of a spirituality that is not living in the values and patterns of this world, but in the values and patterns of the kingdom of God. Jesus, who gave his very life to us as an example of generosity, is our champion and leader. Will you pray with me? Lord, would you help us? It's so difficult to hold loosely to the pocket knives of our hearts and our lives. Would you help us to dream of a better story when it comes to generosity? Would you help us to cultivate a generosity story that truly does help us to take hold of life that is truly life, to be rich in good work, and to be generous, willing to share with anyone who has need around us. May it be so of your church here at UPBC, we pray. And all God's people said, amen.